Alright, this is the video, fifth video maybe, about the chapter 13 is leisure fair. And we're talking about different examples, different social groups where how leisure can be fair or not fair. And the third group I think we're talking about is people with disabilities. Of course, where do you draw a line in terms of disability? And everything, that's contentious and their statistics are tricky, but about 15% of the global population are said to have some type of disability. And of course, that's a broad category. We're talking about physical disability, mental psychological health issues, some of the intellectual disability. It's a broad spectrum of things. Now, that being noted, people with disability are twice likely to have limited transportation. And that's very critical when it comes to doing certain leisure activity, because you have to be a certain place where you may or may not have public transportation, for example. And public transportation, if you do have, may or may not universally designed or adapted in such a way that people with disability can use. People with a disability also less likely to socialize, and that's a very important issue in terms of leisure, because leisure is inherently, many leisure activities are social. So sometimes that's the reason why we want to sometimes facilitate more leisure, because that's a great opportunity for them to increase socialization. And now lastly, when it comes to happiness, this is a very important statistics, because according to one survey, only 34% of people who are with a disability reported that they are very satisfied with their life, while 61% of able-bodied counterparts said they were very satisfied with their life. That's a big difference here in terms of life satisfaction and happiness, about twice the difference. In terms of disability issue, in North America and also other countries, we have important law and regulation documents. In Canada, for example, the chapter talks about the Human Rights Act, which was revised in 1977. That's not like a little over 40 years ago, to add basically a disability issue, to prohibit discrimination for employment for reasons of physical or mental disability. Now, that employment is a key too, actually, for Canadian side. To explain that, we have to look at the US side, which was late, 1990. Literally only 30 years ago, the US passed what is called the Americans with the Disabilities Act, or ADA, which required public institutions to provide full, comprehensive, or equitable opportunities for accessibility to buildings and programs and jobs and so on. So that it's not about just job and employment. Programs included leisure recreation programs, sports programs, buildings, including, for example, airports and sports facility, things like that. Here in ADA, public institutions doesn't mean that those programs and facilities and institution organization have to be funded by federal government or government for that matter. As long as it's open to the masses. For example, restaurants are typically open for anybody, right? Anybody basically work in and have money for that. That has to comply with ADA. Yes. So it has way more reach, right? And it covers leisure recreation, somewhat more explicitly compared to Canada's, legal foundation, which is still focused on employment. It's not necessary, it's not comprehensive enough to cover more leisure recreation explicitly. Of course, that's a theoretical level, that's a legal document level issue, what's written, right? Of course, that's another thing, how many of those leisure recreation programs and facilities exactly follow ADA, and that's another thing. Actually, ADA has very specific guidelines to, for example, physical, things like, for example, desk, right, table at their, arts center, whatever that might be, culture center, how high that should be. so that the people who use the wheelchairs, wheelchair can go in smoothly, for example, hallway, how wide it should be, so that people with disability can, go, walk, whatever, and use that and pass by each other without a problem. There are so many things, how many ramps should be, at the certain facility. There are so many detailed guidelines. Again, how much of that is actually followed is another question. It's difficult. But these are legal context for leisure and, fairness of the leisure, of course, for people with disabilities. Now, the chapter talked about some different approaches to delivering leisure services for people with disability. And that's a very important thing, and that goes beyond disability issues. So I want you to understand that. On the left side picture, and there are three pictures. Left side, there's basically, exclusion situation. So that's the worst situation. The green dots represent able-bodied people, basically, and the colorful dots represent, people with certain disability conditions. Now, this black circle represents some sort of program facilities, whatever that is. So inside means you're included, you're provided, your service is available to you, right? So it's only for able-bodied people. So that's exclusion, that's potentially discrimination. It's not good. That's not what we are aiming for. Now, the middle picture represent what the chapter called segregation. And oftentimes today, it's called special programming or special programs. So we have this program for able-bodied people, but also there's another separate program and facility that's specifically for people with certain condition and disabilities. For example, maybe you have a basketball program for, anybody, but mostly assuming, able-bodied people. But you have a wheelchair basketball program specifically for people with a certain condition or just a disability, for example, as well. So that's a special programming. And that special programs are only for people, people with a minority status, people with disabilities, for example. Okay. And that's the reason why it's called a segregation, because there's separation in there. Now, some people said that this is not maybe the best way because it doesn't facilitate, more overall what is called inclusion, which is the right side picture. In that, there's a program, big one program, and everybody's participating in it. Everybody's included. And that's what we mean by inclusion. That's what we mean by inclusive programs. And we talked about inclusion already. Basically, same concept apply. We're doing something for everybody. We're designing maybe basketball, tweaking in such a way that everybody can play, right? Maybe it's a wheelchair based, and the goals, heights is, changed. There's special rules that apply. Ball is changed, but the ball is more soft or whatever that everybody can play, for example, or even activity is changed, right? More, the activity that anybody can play. Now, with that models in our mind, there are three key principles and concepts that guide our effort to make our leisure recreation programs more inclusive. And those three concepts that the chapter talked about, one is self-determination. What that means is that allowing people, and specifically people with disabilities in this context, to make decisions for themselves, right? And free of the external influences, other people's interferences. And we know that freedom is a very important component of good leisure experiences, right? Like pure leisure, for example. The second concept is self-advocacy, which is about speaking for and on behalf of themselves, as in, let's say, for example, people with disabilities. Historically, there's been a lot of programs, done for people with disability that are planned and done by able-bodied people. It's been a history. For example, there's a program called Special Olympics, right? That's basically athletic, track and field and some other sports activity like basketball, mostly for people with intellectual disabilities. And it's a global things, hundreds of countries participate in that. It's an international event. Now, historically, it's been criticized that the board of the Special Olympics didn't have many people with a disability, intellectual disability, for example. It was able-bodied people, a lot of them. They made a decision, they ran it for people with disability. Now, these days, over the past 10, 20 years, that has been changed to an extent that board, for example, has a representation of people with disability, intellectual disability, specifically some of the long-term Special Olympic athletes are now recruited to the board to actually speak for themselves, do the self-advocacy, make a decision, for example, too. Another thing is that I think Special Olympics now have a program called, I think it was a Global Ambassador program. What that is that they basically, focus on some of the successful, high-profile athletes, and they invite them to training in terms of, no athletic skill, but like basically professional development, right? Like how to wear professionally, how to speak professionally, how to, engage in the meetings and conferences in a, meaningful way, professional way. And they will ask them to go travel to different countries, maybe to different parts of the country, different organization, different stakeholders, to make a presentation, to participate in conference and discussion, so that they can they can speak to the value, the importance of this event by themselves, for themselves. And that's a good example of self-advocacy. And the last principle is normalization, providing life conditions for people with disability that are as close as possible to those of able-bodied person. And that's, it makes sense. It's being used, but that's being also criticized. And hopefully you can see why. Because the assumption here is that the life condition of able-bodied people are better. That's the norm, right? We're going to try to get the life condition of people with disability as close as possible. But why not get rid of that assumption? Like, for example, how, for example, people with the autism spectrum disorder. Why do we consider that the way that able-bodied people interact and communicate is the best and the norm that we should, strive to achieve? Maybe we can interact in a more inclusive way without making, which is better. Maybe we can create a situation. So the normalization is make that clear assumption as to which is better, which is a criteria, which is a standard, right? And that's been criticized and problematic to an extent too. Now, in terms of fourth example group, that's our sexual and gender diversity and minority groups, including, well, many things. This is one of the most probably broadest category that we're talking about here. Again, the statistics is a little tricky, but it's been estimated that about 4 to 10% of the global population are homosexual, and of course, that doesn't, include the entire homosexual and heterosexuals are not their only sexuality stuff, that exists. There are many other forms. So there's a lot of diversity. That's a significant, portion of our society we're talking about. And already in chapter 4, we discussed how people face in terms of, for example, sports and other leisure contexts, fear of rejection, discrimination, even violence, whether it's physical or, more verbal and emotional. And that issue continues. Let's go to homophobia, right? Now, the figure 13.5 in the chapter, the chapter of actually the Boy Scouts participant, the Boy Scouts, specifically the Boy Scouts of America, BSA, has been very controversial when it comes to sexual and gender diversity. It's a good example. They had a ban on member being openly gay up until 2013 to 15, and then lifted it eventually. Now, starting 2019, the BSA started to accept actually girl member as well, which is I didn't know actually until I read this. So it was crazy. You know, I did a Google search, and it's a thing actually. There's a female-only, girl-only troops in the Boy Scouts of America as well. Of course, this is a big step when when you consider about, for example, gender nonconformity, right? You may born more of a female body, but that doesn't necessarily means that you identify as a girl, a woman, for example. So that's a big step toward a more inclusion, right? We talk about inclusion already. The concept is operating, it's a great example. Now, however, that, seeming it's a positive thing, I guess, and yet this upset other stakeholders. For example, the Girl Scouts of America, of course, because when the Boy Scouts, BSA started to get girls, well, that's an existential crisis for Girl Scouts of America. I can see that. But it's, of course, it's not like old girls started to go to BSA. Of course, it's not like that. But it definitely increased the tension with the GSA, Girl Scouts of America. And the Mormon Church basically strongly went against this, homosexuality, gay, BSA members being openly gay. And they basically departed from the BSA. They created their own scouting program in the Mormon system. So there's continuing tensions, conflicts, and issues exist in there too. So it's not like one issue and you fix it and that's good. It's all good. It's really quite not like that in a reality. This, we talked about this acronym LGBTQ, and it gets longer and it's more inclusive. LGBTQ2IA, for example, plus community. And if you don't know what that is, read the chapter. You can also do quick Google search. Has been also a very important leisure consumer market where we can actually provide programs and services and make money too, actually. That's what the chapter discussed. For example, Gay Day. There's something called a Gay Day in Disney Orlando, Florida, in the Magic Kingdom. I think the California one exists, the LA one has that too. But I think it was originally somewhere in March. It may have had more gay days now. But the chapter says that over 180,000 visitors go to this, Magic Kingdom for that specific purpose on that day. And yet this event is not specific or not officially sponsored by Disney per se, but it's protected by Disney's basically no discrimination policy that everybody should. And Disney has been very interesting praise for that too. I know, for example, Tokyo Disney, Japan, there's no, still they haven't legalized same-sex marriage. And, but a few years ago, they did non-legally binding wedding for lesbian and gay couples. And that was covered by media. That was some people consider that was a very important moment. Of course, the LGBTQ2IA plus issue in Japan is far behind, for example, something like somewhere like Canada. But Disney and their sexuality, gender diversity issue has been very interesting relationship. Now, another marketed, commonly marketed leisure programs is a tourism package. There are quote-unquote gay-themed cruise, and that's always contentious because what do we mean by gay-themed? Like, it's not necessarily cruises for gay men, which is part of that too, but also it's marketed in such a way that, for example, good-looking people, men with their, half-naked body, why? They don't have to be. But this sexualized image, hypersexual image was promoted and marketed and monetized, used for money sometimes. But also, genuinely sometimes sexual minority people need this sometimes. For example, having destination wedding. Maybe they're from countries where same-sex marriage is not legal yet. They still seek some sort of legal acknowledgement, and there's sometimes travel to certain countries, which is far more gay, quote-unquote, gay-friendly, for example, and tourism companies and their organization have provided those programs and their services as well. Now, Pritchard's and colleagues' study of gay tourists, it's already 20 years ago, found some of the key factors that there are people, and well, gay people here, consider when they choose vacation destination. And one of the major factors is the safety, perceived safety. And of course, in some countries in the world still, be openly gay, be openly homosexual, engaging in a certain, seemingly, homosexual interactions, although that's not so explicit, considered to be illegal, depending on which country, it is. And this, for example, maps represent how quote unquote gay friendly certain countries are. And somewhere like Canada, it's very, very green. That means very gay friendly, more open, I guess. Some of the red area are not really, right? So some people travel from one way to another, definitely. Another important factor is feeling comfortable with the like-minded people. Of course, because a lot of members of the LGBTQ plus 2IA plus community, they tend to also have certain type of, for example, philosophical, political ideology, like tend to be more progressive, liberal, things like that, for example. So they want to be surrounded by other people who have those perspectives and escape to just specifically gay spaces where being a gay, being lesbian, being non-hetero isn't something that, for example, you have to explain all the time, right? Being stared at all the time. It's really having that safe space is important. It's like special programming in a way that we talked about in the case of people with disabilities. This study, really old, it's an old one, but still very important. Jacobson and Diane Sandel in the States in 1998, they studied older lesbians who created a leisure spaces for themselves to cope with discrimination. And their classic example was this, lesbian softball team and league, actually. Yes, so you have to be, well, at least self-identify as a lesbian to join these teams. And of course, this is not the price to, for example, engage in a sexual, relationship, romantic relationship per se, not necessarily. It's more of an alternative community to provide support, needed support, and validation to each other. And that's what they found, Jacobson and Sandel. And still, these are very popular phenomena in North America and many other parts of the country, world. And finally, in terms of sexual and gender diversity, the tricky part is these exclusively non-hetero, non-binary spaces, leisure spaces, sports spaces, tourism spaces have been also criticized, right, by researchers. For example, Anderson saw these spaces as a form of self-marginalization, putting yourself into a little bubble and refusing to challenge the, broader discrimination. And part of the example is like, for example, gay games. There's something called a gay games. It's a global phenomenon as well. Jarvis also suggested that these gay sports, for example, has largely avoided challenging cultural conservatism, homophobic culture in the sports. And this criticism actually transcends the example of sexual gender diversity. It's been, for example, applied to people with disability context. Really, it's a criticism of special programs, the program that's only for certain minority group, members. It's been criticized. Same logic here. It makes sense from a broader perspective, the organization providing those, services, a societal perspective, especially when we are providing sometimes public funding, for example, this situation. Yes, there's a point to that. Maybe we should support more of inclusion to create a better society, more interaction between different groups of people. However, we have to be very, very careful about who to basically critique, who to blame, and to whom we're putting responsibility for. Because in this way, we're kind of like criticizing the people who are facing this, additional challenge. For example, in this case, homophobia, for example, and they didn't. It's not necessarily it's not their issue. It's the wider society who have this issue of homophobia or discrimination against certain group, and why the people who are, marginalized and disenfranchised and oppressed by that system have to do another extra work, although they're going through more challenges because of that extra work to correct the issue, right? Isn't that more of a society's collective responsibility to address this, right? So we have to be very careful that who are we blaming by this criticism. Although, it makes sense that, there should be some good balance between special programs and inclusive programs. And I've actually did a bit of research in terms of, especially Special Olympics and their special programming for people with disability. What I found though, is that these special spaces for people, the minority group members, is still needed, at least in the States, at least in Canada. That's been true. It's such a safe space that inclusive programs cannot just offer. There's a lot of questioning, a lot of tensions and potential conflict in those inclusive programs. It's just so easy for sometimes minority group members to be in those safe space, only special programs that being, for example, openly homosexual is just normal. Being gender binary, it's just normal. It is just easy. And having that space is still valuable because where our society isn't still there where we can take out those programs. And that's my personal observation based on a little bit of research. So I want you to be a little careful and thoughtful around here. I'm going to stop talking here, and I'm going to see you in the next video.